The Center for Philosophy of Religion presents the modal ontological argument. Some stories could have been true even if they aren't, like an elephant knits an Afghan. Other stories both could have been true and are true, like Socrates drinks hemlock. Let's call volumes that contain the first kind possible books, and let's call the possible book that contains all and only the true stories the actual book. So, if something appears in a possible book, we learn it could have existed. But if a golden dragon appears in a possible book, that's not enough reason to believe it actually does exist. Should we think the same about God? Should we say, sure, God possibly exists, but that's no good reason to think God actually exists? Alvin Plantinga has argued that would be a mistake. There is an important difference between the two examples. For something to be divine, it's not enough for it to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good. It can't even be possible for it not to be those ways. Similarly, it couldn't not exist. That is, if it exists, it would be what philosophers call a necessary being. Plantinga refers to a being who has these features as maximally great, and those are high standards. So when someone says, sure, God possibly exists, we can represent this by imagining some possible book that says God exists. But what follows from this? Well, even though each possible book tells a different story, they must agree about some things, namely, things that are necessary. But remember that being God requires being maximally great, which includes existing necessarily. So if one possible book says that God exists, and all possible books must agree about what is necessary, then every possible book contains the claim that God exists. And since the actual book is also a possible book, it says so too. That is, from the fact that God possibly exists, it follows that God actually exists too. Of course, we couldn't have reached that verdict if we weren't allowed to start with God's possibility. If we started instead with the claim that God is impossible, then none of the possible books would have reported that God exists. But, as Plantinga has shown, it turns out that God, unlike a golden dragon, is either found in all of the possible books or in none of them. So, given the requirement that God is maximally great if God exists at all, then unlike you or electrons or dogs or stars, God is strictly either necessary or impossible. Surprisingly then, merely demonstrating God's possibility would be proof enough that God really does exist. To learn more about these ideas, please visit plantingavideos.com.